I go to New York. My name is Sam, and I live in a small town. One day, I decided to visit New York. I had never been to such a big city before, and I was excited. I wanted to see the tall buildings, the busy streets, and the famous places I had heard about. I started planning my trip weeks before. I booked a plane ticket online, and I found a small hotel where I would stay. Every night, I dreamed about my trip to New York. I wondered what it would feel like to walk through the city, to see the bright lights, and to meet new people. Finally, the day came. I packed my bag with clothes, a camera, and a map of the city. My mom drove me to the airport. I was nervous, but also happy. The airport was big, and I had to find my gate. After a short wait, I got on the plane. It was my first time flying, and I was a little scared when the plane took off. But soon, I looked out of the window and saw the clouds. The sky was so blue, and everything looked so peaceful. The flight took a few hours. I kept looking at my watch, counting the minutes, until I would arrive in New York. When the pilot said we were about to land, my heart started beating fast. I looked out the window, and I saw the tall buildings from far away. It was exactly like the pictures I had seen. When I stepped out of the plane, everything felt different. The air smelled fresh, and the city was alive with noise. People were walking fast, talking on their phones, and carrying bags. It was so different from my quiet town. I took a taxi from the airport to my hotel. The taxi driver was friendly, and he told me a little bit about the city. He asked if it was my first time in New York, and I said yes. He smiled and said, "You're going to love it here." As we drove, I looked out of the window. The buildings were tall, and there were so many cars on the road. Everywhere I looked, there were people. Some were sitting in cafes, some were walking with their dogs, and others were shopping. I felt like I was in a movie. Everything seemed so big and bright. When I arrived at my hotel, I checked in and went to my room. The room was small but nice. I unpacked my bag and sat on the bed. I couldn't believe I was in New York. I looked out of the window, and I could see the street below. There were so many lights, and the city looked beautiful at night. I was tired from the flight, but I didn't want to waste any time. So I decided to take a walk. I put on my jacket and left the hotel. The streets were full of people, even though it was late. I walked for a while, just looking around. I saw big stores, restaurants, and tall buildings that seemed to touch the sky. There were street performers playing music, and I even saw a man making art on the sidewalk. After walking for an hour, I found a small cafe and decided to have dinner. I ordered a sandwich and some coffee. As I sat there, I listened to the sounds of the city. There was music, cars honking, and people talking. It was noisy, but in a good way. I felt like I was part of something bigger. When I finished eating, I walked back to my hotel. I was tired but happy. My first night in New York was everything I hoped it would be. I couldn't wait for the next day to explore more. I knew there was so much to see and do. As I lay in bed that night, I thought about all the places I wanted to visit. I wanted to see the Statue of Liberty, Central Park, and Times Square. I wanted to take pictures and make memories that I could keep forever. The city never sleeps, and even as I closed my eyes, I could hear the sounds of New York outside my window. I smiled to myself, knowing that my adventure had just begun. The next morning, I woke up early, excited to start my day. The sun was shining through the window, and I could already hear the sounds of the city below. I quickly got dressed, grabbed my camera, and headed out. Today, I was going to explore some of the most famous places in New York. My first stop was Central Park. I had always seen it in movies, but now I was standing there in person. The park was huge, with green trees, ponds, and people everywhere. Some were jogging, some were walking their dogs, and others were just sitting on benches, enjoying the day. I walked through the park, taking pictures of the beautiful scenery. It was so peaceful, even though I was in the middle of a busy city. After spending some time in the park, I decided to visit the Statue of Liberty. I had to take a ferry to get there, and the ride was amazing. As the boat moved through the water, I could see the city behind me. The tall buildings looked even more impressive from a distance. And then, in the distance, I saw her, the Statue of Liberty. She was bigger than I had imagined, standing tall and proud, holding her torch high in the air. When we reached the island, I took so many pictures. It felt like I was part of history, standing near one of the most famous symbols of freedom in the world. After the Statue of Liberty, I made my way to Times Square. I had heard that this was the busiest part of New York, and they were right. There were people everywhere, bright lights, and huge screens showing advertisements. It felt like the city was alive. I stood in the middle of it all, looking around in awe. Everywhere I turned, there was something new to see. I went into some of the stores, bought a few souvenirs, and even watched a street performer do some incredible dance moves. For lunch, I decided to try something new. I found a small pizza shop that a friend had told me about. New York is famous for its pizza, and I wanted to see why. When I took my first bite, I knew why people loved it so much. The crust was thin and crispy, and the cheese was perfect. It was the best pizza I had ever tasted. I sat there enjoying my meal and watching the people outside the window. In the afternoon, I visited the Empire State Building. I had seen it from a distance, but now I wanted to go to the top. I took the elevator up, and when the doors opened, I was on the observation deck. The view was incredible. I could see the entire city from up there, the tall buildings, the parks, the bridges, and the river. It was like looking at a giant map. I stayed there for a long time, just taking it all in. I couldn't believe I was actually in New York, standing at the top of one of the most famous buildings in the world. As the day turned to evening, I decided to take a walk across the Brooklyn Bridge. The sun was setting, and the sky was turning orange and pink. It was a perfect way to end the day. Walking across the bridge, I felt so small compared to the giant city around me. But at the same time, I felt like I belonged there. The city was busy and noisy, but it was also beautiful and full of life. When I finally returned to my hotel that night, I was exhausted but happy. I had seen so many amazing things, and I knew there was still more to explore. I sat on the bed and looked at the pictures I had taken during the day. Each one told a story of my adventure in New York. Before I went to sleep, I called my mom. I told her about everything I had done, and she could hear the excitement in my voice. She was happy that I was enjoying my trip, and she told me to take care of myself. As I lay in bed that night, I thought about how much I had learned from this trip. New York was different from my small town in every way, but I loved it. The people, the energy, and the sights were all unforgettable. I realized that this trip wasn't just about seeing famous places. It was about experiencing something new and stepping out of my comfort zone. The next morning, I would have to leave New York and go back home. But I knew I would never forget this trip. New York had given me memories that I would keep forever. As I closed my eyes and listened to the sounds of the city one last time, I smiled. I had always dreamed of coming to New York, and now that dream had come true.